It's a great pleasure for me to be here once again at the Rhodes Forum. It's always been a stimulating and great learning experience for me. And to be on this particular panel with cherished and very distinguished friends who have really been my mentors in a way, who've guided me over these years, is both an honor and a challenge at the same time. I took, perhaps in a overly literal way, the theme of this 13th Rhodes Forum and tried to make myself understand what it might mean to creatively and constructively think about the world beyond the global disorder. And of course, the first kind of pessimistic response is the global disorder appears to be all-encompassing at the present time if one looks at the world from a macro-historical perspective. In that sense, there is no world beyond the global disorder, and one has to plunge into its messy reality in order to come to some kind of relevant understanding. A second way of trying to comprehend this theme is to say that there are two forms of thinking, neither of which will help us transcend the global disorder. The first is to try to envision what might be done from the perspective of feasibility. What is politically attainable given the way the world is structured ideologically and politically. And if you approach the future from the perspective of feasibility, it is a very strong recipe for despair, because what seems possible is not sufficient to do what's necessary for the sake of human well-being, for the sake of peace and justice in the world. On the other hand, if you give way to what one might call the horizon of desire, what you would like to see occur in the world, a spiritual humanism as a point of inspirational coherence, I would say, it seems there's no way of creating a viable political project to connect those values and that political consciousness to where we find ourselves historically situated. So, on the one hand, the perspectives of feasibility lead us to only envision trivial modifications, whereas the perspectives of desire lead us in what I would affirm to be a utopian direction. In other words, a direction where we don't have any real roadmap to connect the present with that desired future. So how in a historical circumstance, there seem to be very difficult, we're in a very difficult set of circumstances. And the effort of a form of this sort is perhaps most successfully measured by the degree to which it can depict that difficulty in a clear and morally suggestive way. Now, my sense is that because we are faced with this gap between what is feasible and what is necessary and desirable, the way of trying to respond that has so far dominated the political landscape has been the effort to achieve a center of domination, a global domination project. And in that sense, as Johan Galtung earlier reminded us, the historical attempt of the United States in particular, and the West in general, to create a kind of unification of the experience of the world, both through the world economy and through the projection of a global militarism. The United States has become the first global state in world history, in my view, which projects its power, this hard power, through up to 1,000 foreign military bases, by having large navies in every ocean, by having a control the militarization of space. So what one has is not truly a territorial reality. One has the hybrid fusion of a territorial, what looks like a normal territorial state, combined with this phenomenon that's not an empire in the traditional sense, but has this global engagement where it feels entitled to impose its political will and values without any restrictions at all. So what I think is important is to find an alternative to this way of creating global unity. An alternative first in thought and then in more plausible behavior terms that neither accepts politics as the art of the possible nor satisfies itself with utopian solutions. So in a sense, what I see this Rhodes exercise as being is one of trying to create a political project out of dialogic understanding. How does one make that transition from a discourse sensitive to the historical originality of our situation, and yet create some plausible avenues for changes that embody that sensitivity. And we start by this sense of what I call geopolitical realism, that it is in its foundation, a state-centric form of addressing the problems of the world. It's a state-centric form that has this hegemonic overlay, which doesn't really enjoy legitimacy. It's a hidden way of exhibiting power and control. But what is evident is that the two most obvious, unmet challenges of our time, the elimination of nuclear weapons and the control of greenhouse gas emissions to avoid global warming, that neither of these issues has been successfully addressed by way of the existing state-centric world order. And it betrays both the ideological and normative failings of this structure. And as I tried to indicate, the American-led effort to deal with nuclear weapons by way of establishing a regime of non-proliferation basically engages in a mind game that tries to make the world believe that the danger of these weapons is not associated with the countries that possess them and have used them in the past and threaten to use them in the future, but rather the danger is with the countries that don't have the weapons. And that is where the focus of political energy should be put. See, and that's such a perverse conception of how to address a potentially apocalyptic threat of a biopolitical nature that can imperil not only civilization, but the species itself. And what I think this geopolitical realism has blocked our perception of the futility of trying to address these problems through these kinds of mechanisms, and has made us aware that only this kind of fundamental revision of human consciousness can address these kinds of problems. And so from that perspective, I think that the most focused problem of this period in human history is the mismatch between the territoriality of political arrangements and the non-territoriality of ecology, of technology, and of the general economic arrangements in the world. In other words, we try to organize solutions from this territorial perspective, and it's embodied in the constitutional makeup of the United Nations, which has states and only states as participants, and therefore has little capacity to promote the global interest or the human interest. And we see this in the climate change negotiations, where it is extremely deficient, despite the scientific consensus, in being able to formulate a common cooperative approach that reflects mutual interests in a way that also incorporates justice and equity. The structures in being don't seem to have that capacity to do that, either for these two issues that are most obvious to discuss, but it applies to almost everything of a concrete nature that troubles us in the world. So you have this inability on the one side to deal with global challenges of global scope, because they're not translatable into cooperation among nation states with very distinct and divergent interests, perceptions, and circumstances. And on the other side, you have the emergence of violent conflict that is outside the scope of global responsibility by being embodied within territorial states. One of the constitutional principles of the United Nations, for instance, is that the organization has no authority to intervene in matters internal to sovereign states. And almost all of the important conflicts within the world today are ones that are internal in some sense. And if you look at what has not happened with respect to Palestine, Kashmir, and then Syria, or Yemen, or Lebanon, Libya, you see the impotence of the normative order in relation to human suffering that is going on. In other words, the way in which world order is structured and ideologized in the modern period is such that it can't promote and protect the global interest and the human interest, either at the macro levels or at the micro levels. And Syria, in my view, is a emblematic case of 21st century postmodern conflict, which has actors that don't fit the paradigm of international relations, which is based on states or political conflict within states. It has non-state actors that are transnational as well as internal. It has regional actors that are engaged in a proxy war. It has global actors such as Russia and the United States that are seeking to create their own global, pursue their own global ambitions in relation to these conflicts. And so Syria is something that is original to this age, where you I think, never had a conflict with so many complexities that are not susceptible to a positive treatment given the structures that exist. And we've frequently heard comments about the refugees and the migrations that have been generated by this Syrian conflict and the Afghanistan conflict and the problems in sub-Saharan Africa, all of these suggest the inability to confine conflict to territorial limits, and yet the complementary inability to address those conflicts in a way that deals with problems of human suffering and mass atrocities of the sort that have been witnessed as occurring in Syria over the past 5 years. So that there is a sense of deep frustration that the international order as it's now constituted cannot address the problems that confront the world, nor can it ignore those problems. And part of what it means to be in the 21st century is this communications reality that gives us a total awareness, and in a certain sense, with that awareness comes a knowledge and a responsibility. You can't be as insulated from the distant cruelties are made intimate realities by this way in which the communications world has altered our sensibility and awareness. In my view, the fundamental flaw of the attempt to address these problems through hard power, this what I call the old geopolitical realism, is partly normative, that it's an unacceptable way of addressing human conflict, but it's also partly a failure to learn from the historical experience of the late 20th century and the early 21st century, in which the most pronounced pattern has been that the side with the superior military capabilities has not been able to control the political outcome and has essentially lost the wars that have been fought. In other words, the weaker side wins, which is a contradiction of the major premise of geopolitical realism, which argues that military power is the primary agency of history and historical change. And this is a lesson that the geopolitical actors seem incapable of learning. The United States should have had a very strong learning experience in Vietnam, where it had total military superiority, invested very heavily in prevailing in the war, and yet lost the war. And what did it do? It didn't understand that in the post-colonial age, hard power doesn't prevail. It's balanced by the mobilization of people capable of resisting in a much more prolonged way than the intervening side, which has a balance sheet of gains and losses, and if things don't go well over a long enough time, it just withdraws. But the people that live within the society that has been the target of intervention, they have been mobilized in such a way as to sustain their conflict. Afghanistan has this proverb, "You have the watches, we have the time." See, and it cuts deeply into the new balance of forces that exists in the world. So you have that new balance of forces, and in a way, India pioneered this sense that political outcomes can be achieved without relying on military power, in opposition to a foreign domination that is based on military power. See, and that's the anti-realist development that is the basis, in my view, of a new realism. A new realism acknowledges this impotence of military power as the agent of history. It doesn't mean that military power has no operative role given the way the world is structured. But it does mean that in these contexts of intercivilizational intervention, which have been responsible for some of the bloodiest and devastating wars of the last period, and have created this sense of futility and failure, there is, if the dominant powers can accept the pedagogy of the new realism, it would take the lessons learned from repeated defeats. It was not only Vietnam, but Soviet Union had the experience in Afghanistan, and the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan a second time. So there is this strong experience, but because militarism is so entrenched in the bureaucracies of the geopolitical actors, it takes almost a social revolution to dislodge it. Argument, rational discourse will not do it. It's instructive to see what the United States and other countries have done in the face of the collapse of colonialism and the failures of the various interventions. What they do is say, we haven't been militarist enough. We have to reinvent counterinsurgency warfare. Or General Petraeus, who happened to be a student of mine, which I don't take very public credit for very often, his career was based on the fact that he rewrote the counterinsurgency manual for the U.S. Armed Forces to show that what was lost in Vietnam could be won by modifying the tactics at the margins. And in the response to ISIS, there's no evidence that this experience has been learned. So the power structure remains in the hands of the old realists, and the alternative of adapting to a world where accommodation and compromise and cooperation are the best avenues to conflict resolution is completely missing from the political sensibility of those that are leading the world. So my sense is that we do have to understand this tension between the territoriality of political arrangements modified by this hegemonic dimension as being in tension with the non-territoriality of economic globalization, of local conflict, and of the sorts of ecological and human rights issues that are of such primary significance at this period of history. And the question that is posed is whether how do the peoples of the world, and the future will depend on the mobilization of the peoples of the world, how do they themselves generate the political will to challenge this entrenched militarism? See, I see that as the only way of thinking of a positive scenario for my own country, the United States. Unless there is a sufficient popular will to challenge both the gun culture within and the militarism without, I see no positive future. And how that relates to what happens in the world as a whole, it seems to me to be very fundamental. And if you do challenge this, if there is a successful challenge to this entrenched militarism, then it becomes much more possible to create the sort of global institutions that can serve the human interest and the global interest, as well as the national interest. And I think it does relate to what Tu Ming was telling us about the dialectical harmony between rootedness and transcendence. And I think but we can't get there without being liberated from the entrenched militarism that exists in the West. So it's not only, in my view, instrumental rationalism, it's also these socio-political structures of violence that have been seen as indispensable pillars for sustaining inequality, exploitation, and domination. Let me stop there, if I may.